Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us on our fourth webinar of the week as part of our build-up to the Lincolnshire Climate Summit. This evening's topic is creating a low-carbon home. I'm Dan Clayton. I'm the Environmental Manager, Sustainability Manager for Lincolnshire County Council. And so we're going to talk about creating a low-carbon home. We've got three speakers this evening. We've got Lee Marshall from Viridis, who's going to talk about retrofitting. Then we've got Sarah Baker from East Lindsey District Council, who's going to talk about local authority support for retrofitting of homes. And then I've stepped in to do the last one. I'm going to talk about the challenges of reaching zero carbon for housing in Lincolnshire. So we'll kick off with Lee, and I'll hand over to him to start his presentation. So over to Lee.
Oh, hi, Dan. Thanks for having us this afternoon and to talk about retrofitting and energy efficiency in buildings. I haven't pulled together a particular presentation, but I'd rather talk through it if that makes any sense, and more so to give a running explanation on the things that can be done and the advantages and disadvantages of that. The first thing I'd like to touch on is in terms of retrofitting and energy efficiency, when we're looking at existing buildings, is the first thing to look at is the energy pathways in the building, or where heat is lost within the building. So how it's lost through the floors, the walls, the roof, the windows, the fabric elements, as it were, of the building, and understanding what the baseline is. So wherever your building is, understanding what the loss is through those individual fabric elements. That allows us then to generate an understanding of the energy loss there, and then what we can do to improve that. From that, then it's the next thing to do is have a look at what the actual, as we call it, U value of the element is, whether that's the wall, the roof, the floor, and look at that without any insulation, and then see what thickness of insulation then thereafter adds to a sustainable amount of insulation, i.e., not over insulating and not over insulating and not under insulating the building, as we can over insulate buildings to little or no gain for the homeowner or the building user. So the additional investment in that insulation doesn't necessarily equate to a long-term sustainable investment in terms of recovery investment for the investment within the insulation, as you see what I'm saying. So what we're finding then with existing buildings, perhaps particularly the building stock that's maybe 75, 100 years old, sort of stock that is, shall we say, existing brickwork, no insulation, lots of buildings that built throughout the UK, sort of 2 layers, 2 courses of brickwork, and minimal amount of loft insulation, suspended ground floors with minimal insulation in those as well. What we're finding with our work is that walls of that nature, for example, what we're finding is that the most efficient improvement on those walls is basically to sort of batten off the walls, as it were, and plasterboard over the top of the battens. And that, in terms of fabric improvement, tends to bring the wall from a particular amount of heat loss to a significantly less amount of heat loss, and it's almost a sort of 50%, 50 to 60% reduction in the loss through that wall. And when I look at sort of the laws of diminishing returns, we say if we follow our curve, the law of diminishing returns, we see that that one element of work, which isn't a high cost element of work, actually reduces the amount of heat loss through that wall by the most significant economical amount in terms of investment, in terms of energy saved. Thereafter, it's not, I suppose, from a cost efficiency perspective, necessary to do this because the gain isn't quite there. But thereafter would be to put a modest amount of insulation in between the battens. So if the battens were 25 mil, for example, and I'm talking sort of pragmatically and with an experienced hat on here, then what we're finding is that putting a modest amount of insulation on that wall, say 25 mil between the battens, and this would be a man-made PR insulation, that plus the plasterboard on that type of wall, which is very, very common and quite a large part of our housing stock. That is the maximum amount of work that would be required to bring that wall up to a more than acceptable standard without over-investing in retrofitting the building and certainly under-investing in retrofitting the building. That seems to us to be the maximum amount of investment required. So if I look at that in terms of energy loss in a building, and if I think about all the different elements we're talking about, walls, floors, roofs, windows, those sorts of things, and I create that into a pie chart, what I'm finding is with, and then I also look at air movement in and out of the building, so doors opening, windows opening, people coming in and out of the building. What we tend to find with those types of building is something like 30 to 40% of the heat loss through the building is just air moving in and out of it. And then we probably have around about 20% or so of heat loss through the openings. And then the remainder is sort of tends to be equally split between the walls, the floors, and the roofs. So we maybe sort of 10, 12% each, maybe 15% each. So if through my walls, for example, that I'm only losing 15% of my heat through my walls, then from a pragmatic engineer's perspective, then I don't want to overinvest in insulating that element because I'm not gaining a significant amount of saving in doing so. So if I come back to my plasterboard and modest amount of insulation in that very old-fashioned wall, if you see what I'm saying, that improvement then takes that up to, we're not losing any more than say 10% of the energy through the wall. And then when I compare that to modern building regulations and the current Part L, where it sets out what U values we have to achieve for those walls and the amount of insulation we have to put in them, what we're finding with that particular modern build is that with a modest amount of insulation, we're really only losing 8% of the heat energy through the walls of the building. So when I look at those two comparisons, then with my existing retrofit building, and I've made a modest improvement, I'm bringing that to a point where it's almost comparable to a modern building with a modest amount of insulation, but levels of insulation that are commensurate with the amount of energy that's lost through the wall itself. What we're finding is that home builders, developers, and the like are putting excessive amounts of insulation in walls. So if a wall is only losing 8% of energy through it, should we be investing in extra installation to save another 1 or 2% of energy loss through that wall? Or should we be investing in alternative energy efficiency measures in the building, such as additional PV, improved lighting, improved efficiencies, and other elements of equipment, which would add more longer-term value to the efficiency of the building. So I suppose in summary from that, just talking about one fabric element. What we're saying is that, from modest amounts of insulation sustainably applied to buildings at a cost level that allows the maximum efficiency gained, that maximizes the long-term sustainable value of that investment. And we're seeing that sort of more modest levels of insulation in buildings are actually more effective and free up budget for other measures rather than over investing in those areas. When we look at that in terms of floors, whether that's solid floors or suspended floors in existing buildings, that's a different technology in terms of the building and needs to be looked at slightly differently. When we look at floors and we look at heat loss through floors, we're looking at whether it's bearing on the ground or whether it's suspended. If the floor is bearing on the ground, then as engineers, we've got to look at the different resistances through the floor and the ground, heat resistances, as it were, and how we deal with that. And what we're finding is that, again, very modest amounts of insulation actually add up to a basically significant sustainable gain in floors. And a way of explaining that would be is when we used to insulate floors in the 80s and 90s, when we had our sort of expanded polystyrene insulation, sort of all the bubbles that were compressed together to create these great big boards. We used to standardize in, say, 100 mil of that in the floor, and that was known as a sort of standard approach to insulating floors. Now, I understand that type of insulation and the thermal properties of that insulation and how much heat it keeps in and how much heat it lets out, as it were. And then when I compare that to more modern forms of insulation, which are sort of the PIR boards, which are more of a compressed insulation of the sort of the foam ball type, as it were, the small foam ball types compressed. Well, that insulation actually performs twice as well as the insulation I mentioned previously. So what that actually means is, in simple terms, is that I need half as much in thickness again to insulate the floor than I did with the previous insulation. So, for example, if I needed 100 mil of the previous insulation, the sort of the 80s, 90s insulation I've talking about, then I only need 50 mil of the more modern insulation. So the question there is then, why are we still putting in the extra thickness of insulation, as it were, when within the floor, from a technical, pragmatic and installation perspective, I need to put less in because the more modern insulation performs much better, as it were. So when I take that a step further and I look at what heat I'm losing through the floor without insulation and what heat I'm losing through the floor with different levels or thicknesses of insulation, again, what we're finding is that very modest amounts of insulation actually achieve a significant increase in energy performance in the floor. And so again, much like the wall, which we sort of talked about earlier, within the floor, certainly on modern builds now, and with the method that we use to determine the amounts of insulation in floors, the minimum insulation we would specify for a floor in a new build property would be 25 mil, and that probably sounds like it's not enough. But as a chartered engineer who's done these sums for quite a few years now, I can assure you that that's certainly the starting point, and that allows the floor to perform extremely well. Thereafter, again, as with the wall, it's sort of your laws of diminishing returns, so it's cost investment against long-term sustainable value. And what we're finding is that as you go up to, say, 50 mil or 75 mil, once you go beyond that point, there's no justification for an additional levels of insulation in that element of the building, and particularly when we consider the cost of the environmental cost of manufacturing the insulation, and weigh that into the long-term sustainable value that it's bringing, and never mind the construction costs associated with putting in additional depth of insulation in certain areas of buildings. So again, as with walls, what we're finding is with floors is that modest levels of insulation are more prevalent and offer a greater value than significant levels of insulation in walls, primarily because it frees up monies within build to invest in other areas or other technologies that add longer term value. An example of that would be perhaps moving from double glazing to triple glazing, for example. So in certain areas, in certain locations, that's a big justification. And particularly where acoustics is an issue or sound is an issue, then if we're retrofitting and we want to make the best long-term sustainable value of perhaps the monies are available to us to get the best environmental gain, then reassigning budget from perhaps over insulating to providing a little bit more glazing or a better type of glazing could be another way of redirecting investment to betterment the occupancy and well-being of the people within the building. So whilst I've touched on glazing, what we're finding is that with our buildings and the work that we're doing is that good double glazing, good quality, high quality double glazing is the right balance of investment in properties. What we're finding is that when we move to triple glazing, we're not seeing significant enough gain in the energy reduction, as it were, to justify the expense and of moving to triple glazing. Now, there's a caveat to that. So as I mentioned there, where if we have acoustic issues, we're roadside or we're heavy traffic roads that residences or buildings are adjacent to, well, then that certainly justifies the move to triple glazing because of the health and well-being need there. Whereas in other elevations of the property, we could probably be more sensible and maintain high quality double glazing, as it were. So those are just a few of the elements that we look at when we consider retrofitting existing buildings in terms of how we insulate, how we look at the different elements, how we look at glazing, how we can perhaps assign budget to other technologies, maybe rather than PV panels, moving to PV tiles, so they sit better in line with the property, things like that. One area though in retrofitting, one area in terms of retrofitting existing properties, and it's a very, very quick win, is upping insulation in lofts, and whether that's insulation above the ceiling or insulation between the rafters as the pitch goes up. There's a bit of a misnomer in that, and it all comes down to the understanding of the particular types of properties of different insulations or insulants that can be used in these areas. And so some, let's say mineral wool, some mineral wools perform a hell of a lot better than others, some by as much as 50%. And so we can insulate lofts very, very well with reduced thicknesses of insulation, but by considering the correct specification or a better specification. And if we're more appropriate in our insulation in other elements of the building and more appropriate perhaps looking at how we glaze or double glaze or triple glaze the building, then that frees up budget to improve specification and insulation, for example, in loft areas where what we're seeing is there if we sort of invest in that area, then we're seeing a better return on investment rather than perhaps overdoing it on walls and floors. So I think I'm coming up towards the end of my time, and thank you very much for listening. And hopefully what I've been talking about in terms of insulating, over-insulating, under-insulating, and how to look at perhaps the residence, the dwelling, or the building globally, and reassigning or redeploying how we insulate or don't insulate buildings generate some debate and some food for thought and some conversation thereafter. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Lee, for that. There's a few questions that have been coming through on the chat, and there's also the Q&A box as well. So what we'll do is we'll go through the presentations first and then have a Q&A session at the end. So now we'll move on to Sarah Baker from East Lindsey District Council, and she's going to talk about local authority support for retrofitting. So I'll hand over to Sarah.
Thank you very much. I have just got a presentation to share, so just bear with me. Can everybody see that all right, Dan?
Yes, yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, so my name's Sarah Baker, and I'm the Climate Change and Environment Manager for East Lindsey District Council and Boston Borough Council. So I'm going to be talking to you today about the work that we're doing through the Green Homes grants, which are funded from the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. We're about roughly 6 months into our programme on that, so I can talk a little bit about what we're doing and our future plans for that. So I head up the Green Homes grants team that's based at the council. So I thought I'd start by sort of setting some of the context about Green Homes grants, because I think there's been various schemes, there's been a little bit of confusion around, it's fair to say, I think, with the way that things are being administered. So essentially, Green Homes grants were announced as part of a package of funding announced by government back in July 2020. And at that point in time, there was about £500 million allocated for what's called LAD, which is Local Authority Delivery. And then the large bulk of the funding was for Green Homes grants vouchers. And that process really was for householders to sort of obtain their own grants, I guess. So there was a platform and various contractors were available on that platform, and it was sort of down to the homeowners to really explore and try and get the quotes for the work and that sort of thing. But I think it's fair to say that it wasn't a particularly successful scheme. And in terms of us now running the local authority scheme, we're still struggling a little bit with some of the bad press that received, because essentially people found it very difficult to obtain the funding through it. And in March of this year, that scheme was actually scrapped by the government. But what they did do then was make some additional funding available for local authority delivery. So we've been quite fortunate to be able, with the initial funding that was available and the top-ups that they've made, to really obtain quite a bit of funding in this area. There are two main schemes. So there's local authority delivery, and then I'll talk a little bit more about a forthcoming scheme, which is called the Home Upgrade Grant, which should hopefully be coming online next year. And the local authority delivery scheme really is around improving the energy efficiency of properties. So in terms of what we are targeted to achieve, it's increased energy performance certificate ratings of buildings. So a lot of you will be familiar with the EPCs that you've had done when you perhaps moved house and that sort of thing. The Home Upgrade Grant really takes that a step further by looking at the low carbon heating side of things for off-gas grid properties. As I say, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And then another angle or aspect to the Green Homes grants is through the social housing decarbonisation funds. So there are various funds available for registered providers to access funding, again, for energy efficiency improvements on their properties. So in terms of the District Council and Boston Borough Council as well, the there are various phases of this local authority delivery funding, and we were successful in the phase 1B of that funding. We secured £2.2 million at East Lindsey District Council, and we are partway through delivering that. It's actually been extended through to next March, and we are hoping to improve 210 properties through that scheme. And the way that the scheme works is really to provide up to £10,000 for owner occupiers and up to £5,000 for landlords. Landlords do have to make a 1/3 contribution to that cost. And as I explain a bit later, that does make it slightly challenging. But yeah, so we were successful with that £2.2 million back in December of last year. And then in March of this year, we secured additional funding, so another £1.6 million for East Lindsey, and just under £500,000 for Boston Borough Council. And again, we're hoping to improve around 160 properties through that phase. So all in all, by March 2022, we hope to have improved in the region of 350 or so properties across the 2 authority areas. We're already planning for the next phase as well. So we have got around £9 million worth of funding bids in for what's called Sustainable Warmth, which essentially is a combination of the local authority delivery and the home upgrade grant that I'll explain a bit more about later. And that will be across Boston, East Lindsey, and we have recently formed a partnership with South Holland as well, so it'll be looking at delivery across all 3 of those districts. So actually, to give you a bit more detail about how the scheme works, it's, as I say, targeted on the energy performance certificate rating of buildings. So we are expected to target E, F and G rated properties. Now we can use a certain amount of the funding for D rated properties as well, but we're really focusing on that lower end. So I'll show some examples later, but for those that aren't familiar, it sort of runs through from A to G. Obviously the G is right down at the bottom in terms of the energy performance of those properties. So they're our focus for this. So we are directly contacting eligible properties from the open EPC register. So any property that's got an EPC, you can do a quick search. It's open and publicly available to look at what the energy rating of your building or your property is. And we are, as I say, writing to those homeowners that we believe to be eligible. Phase 1B, we're really focused on Skegness, Mablethorpe and the coastal strip. And then in phase 2, we've been widening that out across East Lindsey and Boston. The other key criteria for the scheme is that income eligibility is less than £30,000 per household per year. So it really is, it's an energy efficiency project, but it's also designed to look at fuel poverty really and helping to address some of the issues around that. In terms of the process that's taken, once we've identified eligible properties, we then pass them on to the surveyors who undertake a whole house retrofit survey on our behalf. And we are working to pass 2035 standards for this. So it really is that whole house approach that's being taken. And I think somebody mentioned in the chat, I noticed earlier, about asking about ventilation. So yes, we're looking at ventilation alongside insulation measures as part of that PAS 2035 approach and installing those where necessary as well. And then really what we do is we take those recommendations and identify which measures we can deliver within the, for example, £10,000 that we've got available for, say, owner occupier properties. So sounds like a decent chunk of money, but it doesn't always go that far with quite a lot of the properties. So as I say, we have a bit of a balancing act to do. BEIS is very keen that we are improving the EPC rating of the building by at least 1 band if possible. But they also want us to get the maximum number of SAT points that we can. So it's a real balancing act. And again, there's an interesting question in the chat around double glazing and windows and doors, because as you say, it's kind of a high cost, low value measure, and we are very selective about where we will put that in. But there are certain properties where we feel that is the right approach to take. And I say that with a view to thinking about future schemes in terms of low carbon heating. So, if there's a real push through the home upgrade grant that I briefly mentioned earlier, when we're looking at off-gas grid properties, for example, there's a real push for us to be using primarily air source heat pumps. And obviously anybody familiar with those will know that if your energy efficiency isn't really up to scratch, then you're not going to feel the benefit of that. And in many cases, you could send the energy performance of the building in the wrong direction if you aren't careful. So we feel there is quite a strong argument for including some of those what are deemed as low value measures, because we wouldn't be seeking to put air source heat pumps in those properties in the future unless those were addressed. So I say there's lots of different factors that we have to balance in the recommendations that we make. And obviously as well, most of the properties that we're working with are owner occupiers, so they may have a say in that. And while it isn't a program for them to sort of pick and choose their favourites, some people feel quite strongly, for example, that they don't want solar PV, and while we'll always try and persuade them otherwise if that's one of the options that's been identified, clearly sometimes we have to respect that decision. So lots of things for us to look at. Essentially, once those measures are offered out, then say work gets underway. And once the work's finished, a new energy performance certificate is undertaken. That's then uploaded to the register, so that there's a record of the improvements that have been made to that property. So I thought one of the best ways to sort of outline the sort of things that we're doing would to give you a case study. So this was one of the first properties that we've completed. There's a 100-year-old property in Mablethorpe. And the homeowners moved in back in January of this year, and the energy performance certificate on their rating on their EPC was an E rating, and the homeowners said really they were quite surprised when they moved in, sort of on the coast. I think the coastal winds really they found that it was quite a drafty property, and that they were really struggling a bit with heating and that kind of thing. So they got in touch with us and say they were eligible, and we carried out surveys, etc. And the measures that we were able to deliver on this property were to improve the floor and loft insulation, to install solar panels, some smart heating controls, and some low energy lighting as well. And the feedback really from the property owners were, almost instantly the property felt warmer to them, and they were starting to see the benefits of the reduction in their consumption in terms of the difference that the solar panels were making to them. And to actually look in a little bit more detail at the differences this made, the works that were undertaken to that property essentially improved the EPC rating from an E rating through to a C rating of that property. So really made a huge difference. I think ballpark figure, I think the improvements totaled about £11,000 on that one. So I mentioned earlier there's £10,000 per property available. That is an average figure. So what we find is, we might only need to spend 8.5 in one, and we can spend slightly over that in another. So again, that balancing act comes into play. But as you can see from the savings that are given there, this homeowners, based on average savings, should be expecting to see around £45 a month reduction in their energy costs. And the feedback that we've had from them so far, I think they've had these measures in for a couple of months now, they're already starting to notice that difference. So that's fantastic news really. So that kind of puts it, the practical examples of the sort of things that we're achieving with this scheme, which is great. Just as I say, to explain a little bit more about the future scheme, so the Home Upgrade Grant will, as I said, focus on off-gas grid properties, and there is more funding available. So there is up to £25,000 per property available, and that's on a sliding scale depending on the EPC rating of the property. So a G-rated property will qualify for that £25,000, and then it kind of gets less depending on the rating beyond that. And I think that it's fantastic. It's going to be a new challenge for us because, as I said earlier, even £25,000 can not get you very far with particularly a lot of the rural properties that we have in our area. So I think it's been interesting working with some of the contractors that we've had for this scheme, where they've perhaps been used to working out of area in bigger cities, and they can kind of go and blitz a whole area of terraced houses or estates of really similar properties, and obviously there are economies of scale in doing that. They come to East Lindsey and to Boston, and we send them out to, sort of detached or semi-detached properties out in the fens, with very little around them to protect them from the wind and the elements. And the costs that come back for some of those properties are huge. You're talking about EWI costs of sort of £20,000-25,000 alone for some of these, and then that's before you tackle anything else. So I think there are still real issues for us in taking these forwards. And as I say, that new home upgrade grant is really about low carbon heating, and that will be the push, and that will be the targets that we're expected to deliver against for that. But it isn't going to be easy, as I say, because those low carbon heating measures can't be done in isolation. Everything else needs to be up to scratch first. So I think it's going to be a really interesting time for ourselves and other local authorities in trying to deliver that. But obviously the positive message of all of this is that there is significant amounts of funding available, albeit at the moment for those very kind of low income households, and I think that again in itself presents a few challenges, because it is household income. You can have a couple, and if they've got an adult child at home as well, then their salary is taken into account as well, and it can easily push them over that threshold. But that doesn't mean that they aren't in fuel poverty and that they couldn't benefit. So that's sort of information that we're feeding back as well to BEIS in terms of planning for future schemes, because it does make it quite challenging. But I say all in all a good news story that there is this funding available, and hopefully we can continue to help hundreds of properties over the next couple of years as the new phases of funding come on board. So I think that's about it from me, really. So if anybody wants more information about the Green Homes scheme, the contact details are on the slides, and I'll obviously be around for the question and answer session in a little while.
Thanks very much for that, Sarah. Right, so now I'm going to do my own presentation. So I will attempt to share my screen. Is that appearing for everybody? I will. I'll start off then. So I was going to talk about the challenge of reducing carbon emissions from housing, particularly in a Lincolnshire context. So first of all, the County Council funded a survey of a consultancy report of carbon emissions in Lincolnshire. So this looked at just the Lincolnshire County Council area, and it was an assessment of the different proportions of emissions that came from different areas of the economy within the county. And you can see from the pie chart there that just over 30% of our carbon emissions in the county council area come from domestic buildings. And you see there the largest area was transport. Commercial and industry was almost 30% as well. So we've got 30% of that total that we've got to try and remove as we go towards 2050 for the zero carbon target. So that equates to just over 1.1 million tonnes of carbon dioxide per annum coming from domestic housing within the county. And when you look at the data that's available on domestic emissions in Lincolnshire, it's been falling steadily over the last sort of decade, well, probably even longer than that. So so 2005, it was about 1.8 million tonnes a year was coming from domestic housing. That's fallen to, as I say, about 1.14 in 2019. And the reason is because of the decarbonisation of the electricity grid that's been going on kind of nationally with the expansion of renewables, with the wind turbines in the North Sea, and the expansion of solar and the expansion of biomass. All those sort of things have reduced the overall carbon emissions of the grid, and that's led to an overall reduction in the total amount of carbon from properties in Lincolnshire. And that is despite an increase in the number of households within the county over that period. So there's been quite a large expansion of the population over that period. It's gone up by about 100,000 people since 2005, but we've made significant reductions in household emissions. And as I say, that is mainly down to the grid decarbonisation, plus some of the work that's been going on energy efficiency within domestic properties, but that hasn't had a huge impact. So another challenge, and Sarah kind of covered it as well in her talk, is the large number of properties in the county that are not currently on the gas network. So when you look at the map that's available of gas properties and non-gas properties, you see that East Lindsey area, only about 50% of the properties are on the gas network. So the rest are being sort of heated by LPG, oil, electric heating systems, and in some parts of the district as well, and little pockets around the county, in certain enumeration districts, it's over 95% of the properties don't have a gas connection. So when you look at those properties, there is the potential, as this funding becomes available, that to switch them over to lower carbon heating options as part of the retrofit program. So as we kind of mentioned in Sarah's talk about air source heat pumps, that could be one potential, but obviously you've got to look at the rest of the property and the insulation levels as well. It's not just a case of bolting a heat pump onto the side of an existing building and just replacing a LPG boiler with that. You also have to look at the whole house and the insulation levels to make sure that it's adequate. So yeah, there's a huge challenge there that if the solution that the government plumps for in its upcoming kind of heat and building strategy, which is due in the next few weeks, if they talk in there about significant amounts of hydrogen to get lower carbon emissions, then it's going to be a challenge for these districts where large number of households are on the gas network. The other thing that was kind of mentioned in the questions I noticed during Lee's talk was about the Future Home Standard. So this is coming in from 2025, and it's an upgrade to the Part L of the building regulations. There's one section that they've done for domestic properties, and there's also a consultation out for non-domestic properties that's underway at the moment. And the aim of this document is that it's going to reduce carbon dioxide emissions by over 75%. I think the documentation says at least 75% from the changes to the building regs compared to a home built under the current standards. So there's an upgrade to the building regs going through currently that will be introduced in 22-23, and that reduces carbon emissions from a house built to those regs compared to the current regs by about 30%. And then the Future Home Standard, which is due to come in from 2025, goes an extra level and reduces it again by up to 80%. And then the intention is, the government have said in the consultation document, was that after 2025, the Future Home Standard will be kind of ratcheted up to improve the energy efficient levels of houses built to the Future Home Standard. So it's not a kind of finishing point. It's going to be evolving over time, and as we head towards the 2050 date, it will be producing significant reductions in new houses. So the aim is that all homes built from 2025 will be zero carbon ready, and they'll reach zero carbon standard as the grid decarbonizes. So they won't need any additional retrofitting work. That's the aim. And when you look at the U value targets and the air change rates that within that documentation, there's significant improvements on what they currently are. And the U value levels are pretty much down to the passive house standard level that's existed for a while. So a home built to the Future Home Standard is almost at passive house level, compared to current housing standards. So this is going to be a huge change, and we've kind of almost been down this road before, where there was the zero carbon home standard that was going to be introduced in 2016, and the government had kind of outlined that process. But then as the date approached, I think the lobbying from the construction industry was that it's going to be very difficult to meet those standards. So there was a kind of a a backsliding on the building regs. So it'll be interesting to see on what happens as this goes forward and whether it is introduced to this high level. But I think the feedback and a lot of the consultation responses were that it actually didn't go far enough, and they wanted to see higher building fabric standards included within the building regs. So I think that's where the way the government will be heading in the future as well, that they'll be expanding on the and improving the standard as the years go by. So that's the Future Home Standard. How that's been kind of introduced locally. So the Central Lincolnshire Local Plan has just undergone a consultation for an update. So this isn't kind of set in stone yet because it's only at the consultation phase, but the outline local plan kind of adopts the Future Home Standard as its guide for what it wants to see for new houses. So that's within City of Lincoln, North Kesteven and West Lindsey. All houses constructed once this local plan is adopted should be to the Future Home Standard. So that's potentially before the Future Home Standard has been introduced nationally. Those three councils are looking for new properties to be built to this standard, and there are a couple of caveats to that. There's some small areas where there's exclusions and exemptions for different parts of the area, but for the bulk of those three authority areas, they're aiming for this Future Home Standard. And within the text of the local plan, that this is in one of the policy areas of it, it says that new homes will use no fossil fuel energy on site. So effectively it's saying that they will not be allowed to have a connection to the gas network for these new properties. So that's a huge change from, you know, the current kind of building standards, and it'll be you know, a big challenge for developers to implement that, and they'll have to make sure they've got the technology right and the insulation levels. Also, they've said that the property should generate at least the same amount of renewable electricity on site as the demand over the course of a year. So, and it says there as well, preferably on plot. So that's talking about, you know, significant levels of photovoltaics or potentially other types of renewables that are going to be constructed and incorporated into these new properties. And then they've also got a total space heating demand of between 15 and 20 kilowatt hours per meter squared per year, and a total energy demand of 35 kilowatt hours per meter squared per year. So it really is kind of hammering home the need to have a fabric first approach to construction. So yeah, no unit should have total energy demand in excess of 60 kilowatt hours per meter squared per year, irrespective of the amount of on-site renewable energy production. So, you know, when we saw this come through, we were really pleased that the Central Links local plan had put this in there, and you know, now it's on to the delivery of it. And if they can get, you know, all of this through, then that will be a huge step forward for new housing, particularly as there's the you know, there's the large scale urban extensions plan for Lincoln. I think there's 3 of them. There's other large developments planned around the area as well. So hopefully all of those houses will be constructed to this new high standard. So that'll be a huge benefit. So that's new housing. But then the challenge, as we've kind of already heard from Lee and Sarah, is around retrofitting. And I didn't want to go into detail because the 2 previous speakers have covered this, but there are currently 25 million houses within England. And when you look at them, almost all of them, there's very few that are constructed that won't have to have some retrofit activity by 2050 to reach the zero carbon standard. So, you know, and if this kind of work had kind of been ongoing already, then some of the issues around kind of energy supply that we've seen over the last few days probably wouldn't have been as severe, because, you know, we've already have done a large amount of insulation work that would have reduce the gas demand within the county. Another key statistic that was kind of told to me by our historic environment colleagues within the county council was that 20% of England's pre-1914 housing is within Lincolnshire. Now, the challenge of retrofitting a house from you know, a Victorian terrace is completely different to the skills required to retrofit a 1960s, 1970s semi. So it's a whole, you know, different skill set. And that's a big challenge for the county, because we've got so many of those properties within the area. The other thing to bear in mind in retrofit, and Sarah kind of mentioned it in her presentation, was that there's a lot of kind of F and G rated properties that people in there in fuel poverty, is the health impacts of that. So there's been a couple of reports from the International Energy Agency suggest that energy efficiency improvements, 3/4 of the financial benefit will be in health benefits from the occupants, because of the cost of treating people that are in damp and poorly ventilated houses. So the Building Research Establishment estimated that poor quality housing cost the NHS 1.4 billion a year in avoidable treatments through having impacts on asthma and other respiratory diseases. So that's a huge driving force for delivering these retrofit activities, as well as the energy saving benefits as well. I mentioned earlier on as well about the heat and building strategy. So this document is the kind of the government's policy on heating for existing houses. So there's been talk over several years about phasing out gas boilers, and there's been several dates suggested. This strategy is the document that's supposed to put that into policy and legislation, and it was supposed to be out earlier this year. It was supposed to be out, first of all, they said it was going to be March, then it got delayed before the summer recess. The latest talk is that it will be out before the COP26 conference, which obviously starts at the end of October. So within the next few weeks, we're expecting this document to be published. I'm not sure whether the energy market activity over this week is going to influence that as well, because I think if they put in their dates for phasing out gas boilers, that's going to create a press kind of storm and an interest around that. So they may delay this again, but yeah, the aim is to set out the heating options, set out the energy efficiency support options for the people who are not in the kind of fuel poverty part of the kind of retrofit activity. So what's the plan for the rest of the population to encourage them to make their properties more energy efficient? And that's going to be in this heating and building strategy, or we're expecting it to be. There's supposed to be a new support mechanism to replace the Green Homes Grant and the one they phased out earlier this year. And also there's the links to the hydrogen strategy that was published a couple of weeks ago. So that document kind of, it set the overall aims of the government's hydrogen policy, but it didn't really go into any specifics. It did mention that they're planning to create over the next sort of 5 to 10 years, one hydrogen community, so a small area that's powered and heated solely by hydrogen. And then I think the target date was 2025 for a hydrogen village, and then a hydrogen town towards the end of this decade. So we're expecting that this heat and building strategy might have more information on that and the role that the government thinks that hydrogen is going to play in driving down carbon emissions. And there's been some work ongoing that's been reported back in the last week at Keele University. So Keele University is a campus university, and it's got its own gas network around the campus. And over the last couple of years, they've been injecting 20% hydrogen into the natural gas that flows into the network. And they've reported that there haven't been any significant issues. They've used their existing boilers. They've been able to use them happily. They haven't had any additional maintenance problems. So the aim now is that larger areas could be switched over to have a hydrogen blend, and depending on the source of the hydrogen, that is potentially going to reduce carbon emissions. There's obviously the three different types of hydrogen. There's the grey hydrogen that's produced from just heating hydrocarbons. There's the blue hydrogen, where they're talking about carbon capture and storage for the CO2 and other gases that are produced from it, which there have been some trial projects, but it hasn't been run commercially to date. And then the green hydrogen is where the electrolysis of water to split it into oxygen and hydrogen, and then if the electricity comes from renewable sources, then that's a zero carbon source of hydrogen, and that would be the optimal level, but it's having enough spare capacity of renewable energy and also the water resources that you've got to split as well. So that's the things they're going to be looking at in these hydrogen village and hydrogen town projects going forward. And then I wanted to finish off by talking about a kind of zooming into kind of parish council level work. So there's this tool called the Impact Tool, which has been produced by Exeter University and the Centre for Sustainable Energy. So what they've done is they created a methodology to calculate a carbon footprint for every parish in England. So I've got the website in a couple of slides time, and you can go on there and type in your parish council area, and it will show you a kind of overall and a household level carbon footprint for those parishes. And they've taken various different kind of national and local data sources to calculate this emission total. So we were interested in this because it kind of zoom in on the very small areas and look at in detail of what activities you'd have to undertake to get those parishes down to a zero carbon level for 2050. And obviously housing is a big sector of that. So you know, in what areas where you can make interventions to make the biggest contribution to cutting local emissions. The other thing is that Exeter University and the other partners in the project have kind of committed to maintaining and updating this process. So that will be interesting, just to be able to see how the data changes over time, and if you do any interventions, what impact they have on reducing carbon emissions. So I'll just show you a couple of examples of it. So I just picked Greetham and Somerby in East Lindsey as an example area, and it's kind of split out the carbon footprint of that. The biggest source within that area was agriculture, 26.7 tonnes per annum, 46% of the total footprint came from agriculture. The housing is in the red there on the kind of left of the pie chart. It equated to about 18% of the total emissions and was 10.4 tonnes. And that kind of varies. This is one of the areas where I said that there's a low level of gas use within this enumeration district. So Greetham and Somerby has got most of the houses are off the gas network. I think it's about 95%. And then I've compared it with Frampton down near Boston, where only about 20% of the houses there are off the gas grid. It's a similar percentage that housing equates to there, but their households are only 5.6 tonnes, so it's about half the carbon footprint, and that shows the impact of being on or off the gas grid currently on your carbon emissions, because they're having to have kind of LPG or oil heating for their properties are the most common ones. So there's yeah, it's a really useful tool, and I think we're going to kind of dig down into the data and see how it changes for different parishes across the district. So we've got, when you look at it, Frampton was 31 tonnes of carbon per household, and we go back to Somerby and it was 57.7 tonnes. So there's quite a significant difference there, and it could be down to housing side. I think a big chunk of it is down to how the houses are heated, and also the different types of industry that might be within the parish. So you can kind of see that the biggest one in Frampton is road transport. So you do get a lot of haulage activity down in the kind of Boston Spalding area. So that's contributing massively there to the emissions. And there's some projects that we're working at to look at reducing road transport. There's a kind of transitional technology that we had one of the earlier presentations around biomethane for road haulage, that we're looking at encouraging some companies into the area around Spalding to have a distribution centre there that's powered by biomethane, and a kind of fueling depot as well for that. So it's a really useful tool, and it's really interesting to go through the different data and look how it changes from parish to parish and from district to district. Yeah, there's the web link to it. So it's impacttool.org.uk, and then you can go on and find your own individual parish. So what we're intending to do with that, we've got a bid into the Community Renewal Fund, which is part of the government's replacement of the EU funding that was in place previously, and it's going to morph into the Shared Prosperity Fund in the coming years. But we've got a project in called the Green Lincolnshire Project. We're aiming to have a zero carbon parishes project, and this will look at housing, but also look at transport, biodiversity projects, and wider energy efficiency for other buildings that are within the parish as well. And we're hoping to do a trial project with about 10 parishes across the county, where we work with them, we work with the parish council. We've kind of got a trial project where we've been working with Netlham already, and we're also linking it to our tree planting projects as well. So this is the kind of work that we're aiming to do, to start looking at some of these housing missions that aren't covered by the government funding work that's already underway. So I think that's the last of my slides. Yeah, so I'll stop sharing, and we will look to go to the question and answer session. I saw there were a lot of questions that had appeared in the chat and the Q&A box. So yeah, so I'll go through the Q&A ones first. So there's one from Sarah Mills saying, is there confidence that large house builders will support the improvement of the Future Homes Standard this time around? So I don't know whether anybody wants to take that one.
I'll have a go, Dan.
Yes, Lee.
Well, I think it's going to be a bit of a cart and stick, if I'm being truthful with it. And we work with a number of builders, large and small, and some grasp sustainability a little bit better than others. And I think they will, but I don't think it'll happen sooner. I think it'll be sort of post 2025. I think that sort of journey towards 2030, I think that 5-year bracket will probably be more significant for that sector rather than the current 5 years. I think they seem to take a little bit of time to grow into these things. They maybe have sites that rightly or wrongly have had planning permissions on them for 7, 8, 9 years, and they can still build to those regulations. So I think that that journey for that type of builder will be the sort of a harder one perhaps than others to move into that arena, particularly as their cost modeling, their customer base, although when they sort of bring in the sort of the business critical things that they're thinking about in there and how that impacts in the long-term business, I think that'll all factor into the decision-making processes, whether they adopt sooner or later. I think that the market conditions will change on a positive note, and that younger house buyers will demand on command a higher efficient building with sustainable technology, low heating demand. I think that market is emerging, and I think that'll be a big driver that may accelerate the change in builders. So I'm very positive about that. As a market driver, but I think that's what will take that market to do something about it. Really.
Yeah, thanks for that, Lee. And something we were talking about before the session started, was around skills for builders. And do you think we've got a broad enough skills base to kind of deliver some of these technologies in place already?
No, I wouldn't agree with that. I think we're really underwhelmed with skills in the industry at present. And I think it's a sort of in my experience in the construction industry, as it were, and energy industry, we seem to go from famine to feast. And we actually realise, for example, that or the nation's bricklayers are all in their 50s, and we've got no bricklayers coming through. So all of a sudden, there's a great big push to bring more young bricklayers into the industry, and it's the same with plumbers and electricians. We never seem to have a sustainable line. It's all about boom or bust in those industries, and I think we've got quite a lot to do at a policy level to reorganise that.
Yeah, and is that the same for you, Sarah? Have you had issues recruiting, contractors to do the retrofitting work?
I think that's an interesting one. So we've been forced slightly, I would say. We'll get a better idea of that with the next phase that we have. So because of the timescales, we were kind of forced down using existing framework routes to procure the contractors. We are planning for the third phase, because we've got a longer time period to actually go out and do a full tender process for that. So I think it'll be really interesting, everything crossed, that we can find what we need to deliver that. But I think and it's a really good point around this, that actually from kind of the whole idea of local skills and supply chains, there's some real opportunities here as well. And I think that's something that we have to recognise. A lot of the time, so perhaps the more kind of climate change denier side of things just see this kind of spending on these measures, and it's perhaps a bit of a falsity for that. But actually, when you look at it from the other point of view, I think there's real economic and social benefits to be had from this. So in terms of upskilling, particularly come back to sort of East Lindsey and you look at kind of skills gaps, particularly around the coastal areas, for example. I think by working in partnership with the colleges, the providers, we were talking earlier about the universities, I think there's a real opportunity here to be providing kind of new skills and getting new people, and perhaps some of the older ones that are looking for kind of career changes as well. I think there's real opportunities within this industry, and I think that, say, the local economical benefits can't be kind of underestimated if we get it right.
No, that's that's interesting. Lee, there was a couple of questions that came in during your presentation from Peter, and he asked, what software do you use for your calculations, and are you taking the Future Home Standard into account?
Well, I suppose I'm going to, as very artisan answer to that question. I use my 1980s Casio calculator and a pad and a pen. When we're doing our say our heat loss calculations, for example, for buildings, then I'm very old-fashioned my approach to that, and I do my U-value calculations by hand because I know what the building's actually doing. Some software, you can navigate it, but you don't actually know what's going on behind it. So, for example, with RDSAP and SAP, I remember in the late 90s being assigned the task of actually doing it out by hand and going through all the boxes, the many sheets to get the energy consumption of a building using SAP. And so when I'm looking at U-values for floors, walls, roofs, all those sorts of things, because I'm doing it by hand and I'm not relying on, say, a product manufacturer's information, then I can see what's happening with the energy pie of a building, where all the heat's going. Then when I start using SAP, RDSAP, when I start using that and look at the numbers that it's giving me, what I find with that software is that it's good at giving me an end energy consumption and some bits and bobs on lighting energy use and heating and overall heating. But what I think would be very useful with those calculations is if they would give us a pie chart to say that I'm losing this much heat out of my wall, this much heat out of my loft, this much heat out of my windows, this much heat out of my floor, and give that as a percentage. And then that would give us the opportunity to make an informed decision using that software as an example. Say, well, actually, the software is telling us this, and it corresponds with the advice that it's giving us. Whereas if it doesn't, if we're not getting that advice, we say, well, actually, we can get a little bit more out of the building by doing it slightly differently. If you see what I'm saying, and still achieving the requirements of Part L. And so, if I could touch on that for a moment, actually, when it comes to Part L, there's three criteria: criteria 1, 2, and 3. Criteria 1 is the lawful requirement. The lawful requirement for building regulations is that we get our CO2 emissions lower than the notional building that you're measuring your building against. That is the lawful requirement. The next one's about U values. and limiting standards. Now, limiting standards, that's statutory guidance. So how we do that, it's completely within the realms of we as innovative and pragmatic engineers to say, well, if we shuffle things around a little bit, are we still getting the same answer or better? And then criteria 3 is about passive design, fabric first, and the avoidance of overheating and the avoidance of air conditioning. So within those 3 things, within our own great national regulations, we've got the wherewithal to really develop and challenge energy consumption in buildings without too much trouble. And things like RDSAP and SBM all help us do that.
Great. Yeah. Well, Peter went on to ask when you were talking about the double or triple glazing measure, and he was saying that in RDSAP and EPC terms, improved glazing is regarded as a high cost, low SAP improvement measure. As a chartered engineer, please could you provide your view of this?
Thank you, Peter. I hope you're not picking on me. Yeah, as if I go back to my point before about understanding where the energy profile is in the building and how much you're losing for each of your elements. So, for example, if I've got a single glazed building and that's 40% of my energy loss, and my wall is performing reasonably well, and it's 12% of my energy loss. Well, when I look at that and look at operational energy across the year, then straight away that's a target for me. Is that single glazing, isn't it? So if that moves my energy loss then in that element down from say 40% to 20%, 15%, so that's basically 20% of the building energy loss that I'm reducing in that one element. And that may mean that I don't have to do anything with the walls because they're performing really well, anything with the floors because it's doing not so bad, but then the loft might need another 100 mil if there's 200 mil in there already. So when I look at it in that context, then it would probably be the right thing to do. Whereas if we've got challenging across all of the elements, then we might have to take a different view on it. So
yeah, no, I think that's useful. Sarah, there's one from Patty who says about owner occupiers that aren't covered by the existing, their income's too large for the existing, the LAD and the HUG and all those similar schemes. What retrofitting information and resources can local authorities offer to them? And so you kind of mentioned that there's quite a lot of kind of cowboy operators out there, and there's no way of knowing if a contractor's honest or reputable. Will local authorities be producing lists of approved accredited contractors and providing general advice to all residents in the local authority area?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. We've found that, again, in sort of delivering the schemes that we've done, that's the feedback we've got, that people are quite nervous of another scheme because there's so many people operating in this market, and it's very difficult to know at the moment kind of who you can trust and who you can't. I think it's interesting feedback, and I say at the moment, I guess we don't have that facility, but I can see why it's something that perhaps as a local authority we should probably look at further. Whether we get to the point where we can kind of recommend specific contractors or not, I don't know. It's certainly something that I would sort of take away and have a look at. I think obviously from our point of view, we have to use contractors that are Trustmark registered. We ensure that they are working to PAS 2035 standards. So there are certain things that you can look out for, and I think the local authorities could probably do some more in terms of putting together perhaps an information pack, and that might be something we could look at doing, to link up across all of the local authorities in Lincolnshire, to be honest, to look at the sort of information that owner occupiers need to be looking for when they are looking for contractors, perhaps. Because it is a difficult market, I guess, out there at the moment. So I think I don't have an answer to say yes, we're absolutely doing that, but I think it's certainly something I think we could take away actually and look at that in more detail and say link up across the county as well, perhaps. Yeah,
no, I think that's a good idea. It's definitely required, isn't it? So there was also a question from Peter about does the county council have a PAS 2035 retrofit assessor and coordinator. I don't think we do. I don't know whether any of the district councils do.
We are currently training 2 of our officers as retrofit coordinators. So we're quite fortunate that we had an officer at Boston and an officer at East Lindsey who had the kind of required pre-entry qualifications to be able to undertake the retrofit coordinator course, so that we can do more of our own independent assessments on this coming forward. So I don't know about any of the other districts, to be honest, but I think it's something that as we all kind of develop these schemes more going forward, I think we probably will need that in-house. So we're fortunate to be starting that. But yeah, it's having that independent assessment in-house is going to be really valuable, I think, going forward.
Yeah, I think that definitely is true. One question I had for you, Sarah, was around the kind of consistency of money for this kind of work, because in the past it's kind of been where districts have had to bid for the money, and then you might be successful one time and then the next time you might be unsuccessful. And I think the way they do it now is where they're allocating funding, aren't they? So if you can come up with the projects, then you kind of certain to get the funding. So that seems to be a better way to kind of build that momentum up, doesn't it? I don't know whether you found that.
Yeah, it's still a little bit hit and miss. So you're absolutely right. I mean, from having the competitive bid process for 1A and 1B, phase 2, they use the Midlands Energy Hub to kind of coordinate, and they did provide allocations to us. So we had to put a proposal together to demonstrate we could spend the money, but the funding was there to be had. Phase 3 again has kind of gone back to the competitive approach. So we've found ourselves sort of hedging our bets a little bit. So we have a consortium with the Midlands Energy Hub, who they've had to bid for funding this time round, and then if they're successful with that, they will give us all an allocation. And we also then have our own smaller bid in, just because we didn't want to put all our eggs in one basket. But and that, I think, demonstrates the slight issue there, really, that I think that approach of, we know how many homes, by and large, we know how many homes are effective, we know roughly where they are, that the proportional approach to providing local authorities with allocations and then having to either agree or otherwise whether they can accept it and take the proposal forward seems a much better approach. And it's a bit of a shame that we have gone slightly backwards this time with the bidding process, because it does make it a really long and lengthy process, really, from just to give a scale, with initial bids were in August, and it's unlikely we'll be delivering until next March because of all the different steps in between. So yeah, I think there's still a little bit of a way to go in terms of how the funding is allocated, but there are so many properties to go at. I think a different way of doing it could be more beneficial.
Yeah, definitely. I think when you were saying about how many millions and the number of houses you'd done with that for that money, it kind of shows the absolute scale to kind of do the whole of the housing stock for 2050. You get to some enormous sums, don't you, to retrofit every property is going to take billions and billions, I think. Yeah,
absolutely. And I do think we come up against the rural nature of not just East Lindsey, but I think Lincolnshire as a whole, in that it's, like I said earlier, £25,000 in the next phase per property sounds like a lot of money, but some of these properties could easily swallow maybe 45, 50 to get them to where they need to be. So you compare that with, as I say, kind of where inner cities where you've got perhaps smaller properties, lots of properties of the same sort, and the economies of scale. And I think the rural nature has got forgotten a little bit in that. We've still got a huge challenge ahead to get to where we need to be.
No, yeah, thanks for that. Lee, there's a couple there for you. First of all, what smart heating controls do you install, please?
That's an easy one. That's humans.
Right.
I think we're the smartest heating controllers that there are out there. We know when we're hot and we know when we're cold. And I think the best controllers that we've got are the ones that allow us to be in control of our environment. And I suppose that would be my hopefully not too flippant answer on that one.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's fine. And then another one is, are you having to take into consideration the possibility of much warmer summers and overheating in the future when retrofitting?
Yes is the easy answer to that, and but we've got great advantages in our existing stock, particularly the older stock, because if we think about older stock that might be built out, particularly in this region, of your my favourite building technology, which is the Cafarata brick, as so much carbon has been locked into that simple product over tens of years, hundreds of years in the manufacture of that, and they're so recyclable. If we've got that type of technology in our buildings, and we've got those sort of 2 courses brick, well, that's a heavyweight wall. And what tends to happen with that type of building is that heavyweight wall keeps that extra heat out of the building, that absorbs, that buffers that heat going through. What we've got with modern construction now is, with our timber framed construction, so it's our internal skins are very, very lightweight. Brick is very, very lightweight just now, and so that gives us a lightweight shell which keeps the heat in the winter but doesn't keep the heat out in the summer. And I think one of the challenges we've got as an industry really is reimagining how we do that. So if we look at the solar orientation, particularly on new builds, should we have heavier walls on the southern orientations, medium walls, lightweight walls on the east and western elevations, and then on the northern elevations, super light walls, really well insulated, and maybe reimagine how we design our buildings in relation to those sorts of things. And that all sort of ties into sort of fabric first approach, doesn't it, and passive solar approaches to building. So I think yes is the answer to that, and I think within the rules and the goalposts that we work to within the UK in terms of energy efficiency, we could do that with ease.
Oh, that's great. Thanks for that, Lee. So there is one question about the non-gas map that I had on my slides. I'll put the web link for that on the slides when they get shared, so that you've got that if you get the slides, and they'll be available from the County Council's Green Master Plan website. So I think that's all the questions that have appeared in the chat and the Q&A box. So it just kind of leaves me to thank all of our speakers this evening. I think it's been a really useful evening, and hopefully people listening in have got a lot of benefit from it. So thanks to both of you. That's been great. And we've got the Climate Summit in person coming up on the 13th of October at the Epic Centre. So if there's anybody listening in who hasn't attended that previously, then you'd be very welcome to come along. So yeah, so thanks very much to our speakers, and good evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.